So welcome to the Mind and Clip Theology podcast. We are delighted to be joined today with two of us twin authors and contributors, Konnie and Wendy, and we'll get to them in a second. But first, we want to delight and celebrate Dr. Amy Panton, who graduated from Emmanuel College this month. So congratulations, Amy. How does it feel to be on the other side?
Ooh, it feels good. Thank you, Miriam. Yeah, it feels really good. Convocation was last week, so it was really nice to celebrate with everyone. And I'm just so grateful for my supervisor, Pam Carroll, and all the hours and hours of love that she poured into me as we were working on my dissertation. And yeah, it's been such a good journey. So if a hard one, a really hard one, but a good one. So if anyone out there that's listening is thinking about pursuing a PhD in theology, I would say go for it. Go for it. It'll make you it'll help you to grow a lot. Yeah, I feel more like myself now, which is kind of cool. It really helped me to learn and grow a lot.
And I would say find good support.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I was really blessed to have I have like a very cool therapist. So she like journeyed with me all through my 7 years of studies. So yeah, for sure having those supports are so important.
Yeah.
Wow, congratulations. That is pretty awesome.
Thanks. Yeah.
Congrats, Amy. That's amazing.
Thank you.
So, we should do an episode Monday soon on your work, Amy. But it
Sure.
is,
I'd be
well,
happy to.
then I did again to have Wendy and Konnie. So, can you both introduce yourself, where you are, and how you're connected to the journal? So maybe Wendy, you can begin us off.
Sure. Well, I'm a former preschool teacher, and I live out in a very remote spot on the Alsea River in Central Oregon. Um, and I I basically heard about this through Vicky. She's a pastor who also leads a little art group up in Vancouver, which I join with online, and she is has been really familiar with your journal for a long time, and so she introduced me, and I thought, wow, this is really awesome. So I'm just really happy to be here. And I think it's really great what you guys do.
Thank Wendy, and we're happy you're here. And Connie.
Thank you. I'm Konnie. I am currently a PhD student at Emmanuel College, which is how I heard about the journal. And I love what you guys are doing in terms of both MAD and CRIPS community. I have studied trauma for quite a while now. I did my THM as well as PhD work now, which I'm still working on in trauma studies and theology. So I'm kind of bridging the gaps between those two disciplines. But more recently was diagnosed with, in the last 5 years, or I guess 7 years, with two different autoimmune disorders that are fairly debilitating. So I just more recently have come to the recognition of the beauty of what you guys are doing for the disability community and how important that work is. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate being on here with you today.
Well, thank you so much to both of you for being with us today and for taking the time out, because I know you probably have a lot going on, so we really appreciate it. Okay, so now we're going to get into some of the questions we're hoping to talk with you about today. So as Miriam said, you both contributed to the spring 2024 issue of the Canadian Journal of Theology, Mental Health and Disability, kind of like in two different sections. So Konnie wrote sort of an academic paper, and Konnie, it was a part of your master's thesis, right? Am I remembering that right? This chapter?
Yeah, it's
okay.
part of my Master of Theology thesis.
Okay, awesome. And then Wendy put in a beautiful poem that she had written as a part of the art group that she was just talking about. So I was wondering if I could invite you both to just give a brief summary of what your pieces were about. So Wendy, could I invite you to go first?
Sure. Well, it sounds so simple when somebody asks you how you are. It should be something really uncomplicated, but it's not. When you've got things going on that, especially when it's more invisible disabilities that are kind of hard to explain. And so, I don't know, it just kind of came about that uh, Vicky was reading a poem by Mary Oliver, and that poem to me really captured that feeling about sharing your despair. And at the same time, she was looking up at the geese in the sky and being inspired, and her energy was being pulled up. And so that kind of push pull about when somebody asks how you're doing, that just felt to really capture it. And so that's how the poem came about.
Thanks, Wendy. And Konnie?
Yeah, so my piece comes out of some of my work looking at sexual abuse and trauma and how that is received in congregations. So as a minister of for the past decade or so, I've worked in ordained ministry in congregations with a lot of mainly women, some children, and some men who have experienced sexual abuse in various forms. I did not come into this work intentionally in any way. It just kind of, I backed into it. And so the article is really about how our theologies affect how we deal with, relate to, comfort, converse with those who have experienced trauma, specifically relating to sexual abuse, and how the church historically has had theologies that have been problematic at best in relating to survivors, and at some times further the harms that survivors have already experienced.
Yeah, I think your pieces are both for congregations and beyond too. Yeah, and we pick upon for their practices and their theologies, which shape back the course. So now we're spending a little time digging deeper on Connie's piece, and then we'll turn over to Wendy. So Connie, in your piece, we will talk with the idea of reframing and re-narrating one story, which is important for healing and for justice. And also the relational notion of the doctrine of providence. And we wondered if you might just spend some time reflecting on those pieces.
Yeah, thank you, Miriam. Yeah, I think I'll take the second half of the question first, the relational notion of providence. And so I think historically speaking, the idea of the doctrine of providence, it originated with some of the historical church fathers. And what was meant, Calvin, actually, John Calvin, meant the doctrine of providence to be a comfort to people in his congregations. It was written with the intent of bringing comfort in the midst of trial, which I kind of laugh at today because it comes across as very judgmental, especially through a postmodern lens. But essentially, his idea was that God is with us at all times in all parts of creation. But then he goes into this piece on just dispensation, is the theological terminology for it. But he says that everything is somehow ordained by God, the good, the bad, the ugly, and that God actually uses, I believe he uses the term like thieves and liars and other sinners to work out negative things in the world for God's purposes. He attributes things, the cause, in his language, primarily to the individual who enacts violence in some way or another. But secondarily, the causation is God, because everything in Calvin's mind is preordained. Obviously, this is problematic when talking about sexual abuse. Particularly, as I mentioned, I've worked with many minors, children who've faced sexual abuse. This is incredibly problematic to think that a good God has somehow preordained this as a punishment or as a way for the person to learn. And I don't think Calvin himself, if he had thought this through the lens of sexual abuse, would even have stuck with his points so strongly. I mean, I don't know, I'm speaking for Calvin, but more recently, there's been a couple of authors, Mark Elliott, as well as David Ferguson, and they've looked at more of a relational notion of providence, talking about how providence is not so much about God preordaining every little thing, but providence is about the dance of humankind with God, the movement, the back and forth interaction of the Holy Spirit working in the world. And I love this quote. Let me see if I can find it. But Mark Elliott talks about the agency of humankind engaging with God as well. And I think it's through a relational notion of divine providence, when we're talking about things like agency, that humans are empowered to interact with God in a back and forth dance, that providence can be really helpful in thinking through God is with us in our pain. God didn't bring it upon us. God didn't cause it, nothing like that, but is with us. And sure, the experiences we have experienced can be reframed, but that always happens from the place of the survivor, not from a minister preaching a sermon to get over it or anything like that. That's not I would say that's not even Christian in its thrust. So so that's kind of divine providence and a relational notion or framing of it. When I talk about reframing in the article, I want to be very cautious. That comes out of some of the work of Donald Capps, who is a pastoral theologian or pastoral psychologist. It's kind of he kind of has feet in both of those fields, or did. He passed away. He was my MDiv thesis supervisor. And so I worked with him for a number of years back in Princeton. And I think some of his writing kind of teeters on the positive psychology movement, but he also, as a theologian himself and just a deep believer in a faithful God, I think some of that it gets missed in just reading his work. And so the notion of reframing trauma, his work specifically talks about the story of Joseph in scripture and how Joseph himself actually reframes his trauma. And Joseph says, what man meant for ill, God meant for good. But it's not a theological statement that Joseph is making. He's not giving a blanket theology on God created this evil thing to happen so that I could be made. It's a statement of a survivor reframing their own story and saying, you know what, this awful thing happened to me, but God has used it for good. And so reframing always comes from the place of the survivor, not in any way imposed upon them. And I think that that's a really important thing to point out and to put forward when we're talking about sexual abuse in any way. That it's not a tactic for a therapist or a minister to use to help somebody. But as Judith Herman, who's in the field of trauma specifically, not in theology, she talks about it slightly differently, but she says reconstructing a trauma story. And so her language is perhaps a little more helpful, but that comes from the place of the survivor really figuring out and narrating their own story so that it is a meaningful narrative in the course of their life.
Thanks so much, Konnie. Those such great things for us to think about there. And I really appreciate you bringing the Joseph story into the conversation. So thank you, and thinking about Joseph as a survivor. So when Miriam and I were thinking about the questions we wanted to ask you, we were reflecting a bit on your author's note, and we wanted to ask you, can you talk about how the roles of mother, survivor, woman, and pastor mingle together and impact your theology and your work as the theologian?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think you can't untie your identities at all. And they bleed together whether you want them to or not. But just, I think I noticed this for the first time in a preaching course a decade and a half ago, where we were given the task of looking at the story of the Samaritan woman at the well in John 4. And everyone in the class, all 50 of us, were supposed to write a sermon on this story. And we broke off into groups and we listened to 8 different versions, 8 different sermons from 8 different people in our groups. And as I did that, I recognized that people were seeing this story through many different lenses. And many of the individuals referred to the woman as a sinner or as somebody who was wayward, there were all sorts of adjectives labeling this woman in ways that I found were very unhelpful. So Jesus says to her, I have the text here, and he says, "Go call your husband and come back." And she says, "I have no husband." And Jesus says, "You are right when you have no husband. The fact is, you have had 5 husbands, and the man that you now have is not your husband." So, I mean, this is a problematic text. And I love some of the work of like Phyllis Tribble, who interrogates scripture and wonders like what is behind this. But even before I had read her, I read this and I saw, well, why has she had 5 husbands? And this isn't a time that it was socially appropriate to have more than one spouse. So I'm like, what's going on here? There must be something deeper. And I was interrogating it and wrestling with this piece of scripture that I found deeply problematic. And I brought that through in my sermon for this course. And later I made that a practice as I brought it through in congregations, not filling in her story for her, because that doesn't do justice to her or to the scripture, but to question it, to actually say in a sermon, what happened to this woman? Divorce? Abuse? We don't know. But to name those things, those possibilities, and to say, I wonder what happened here. Why has this happened? And to remind the reader that everybody has a story. They don't end up, quote unquote, that way just by happenstance. People get to where they are as a result of things that have happened to them, things that have been done to them, sometimes by choices they have made, all different reasons. And I think, so that has, as a survivor and as a sister and friend and caregiver of people who have experienced violence against them, that has come out in my preaching. And then as that came out in my preaching, more and more people came to me saying, "Can I talk to you about this?" Because so much of the time, I mean, just statistically speaking alone, most people are hearing from older white male preachers in the mainline church in Canada or the States. So that is a very different lens that I'm looking through. And that is kind of how my pastoring has been affected by these things, and how my pastoring has affected the other areas of my life, and particularly mother, I think, is a complicated one. I have 3 daughters, and I actually was pregnant with my first daughter as I was sitting in a trial for as the key witness for a child who had been abused. And and as those identities mingled, like that forever reshaped my preaching, my teaching, the way I interact with my own daughters and their friends, and the way I interact with other survivors. And that largely is why I ended up writing not just this piece, but that thesis was that experience of being a mother to be, sitting on the stand, sharing stories that had been shared with me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Konnie. It's so true that we can never say, "Oh, today I'm a theologian," or "today I'm a etc." It's like where everything all at once and all these experiences tie in. So, and I'm grateful also to how you're aware of that and how you recognize that importance in your ministry.
Thank you, Miriam.
Turning to Wendy for some time now. We wondered if you could begin Wendy by reading us your poem.
Sure. Okay. So, how are you today? Sometimes is greeting, yet a question. Mask I wear, it answers, I'm good. Alternatively, about the same. When I remove the mask, swirling mix, positive spins, God's angels are around us, his saints, most of all our Savior, our Blessed Mother, all true. And true this overwhelm, will this pain ever stop? This nervous system rewired, jolted, rerouted, confused. Never know when the monsters will roar in there, pull up carpet, can't make plans. Open target, crash, boom. Ground hits hardest when folks don't see it's happening, when don't see the monsters are here. And if I'm being honest, I need help. Your help. Caregivers, doctors, priests, neighbors, friends, family. I need you to see how things are for me. Look the monster in the eye. Not sympathy so much as empathy. And you're solid, true, to feel, to do. Take my hand and we'll get through this. Tell me about your despair, and I will tell you mine, says Mary Oliver. Meanwhile, the wild geese, high in the clean blue air, she continues, as I continue to hold both these things and wrestle how to say this, how to answer how I am today.
Thank you so much, Wendy, for reading that for us. What a beautiful poem.
Thank you.
When Miriam and I were sitting and thinking about questions to ask you, we wanted to pick up on the Mary Oliver quote there. We were wondering why do you think it's hard for us to talk about our despair with one another?
Well, I guess maybe one layer is that when you bring up a problem, people can feel like, oh gosh, I've got to do something about that. And people have different reactions to that. There's different personality types. Some actually love a challenge like that, and others that feels kind of threatening that, oh gosh, this is something I can't do anything about. And I guess it depends on what you're presenting. If it's something that they feel that they can handle, that, oh, I can do something here. Where that's easier if it's a condition that people understand and there's already kind of pathways and things that people know you can do. But when it's something that there's not a lot of public awareness on, when you've got more an invisible disability, that's really harder. And then it's kind of overwhelming because they're starting from scratch to even figure out what to do. So I think that's one reason. And I guess the other reason is on the speaker's end, that if you don't feel receptivity in the other person, then you kind of clam up and it's hard to share something like that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Thank you so much. I think you're right on both accounts there, and sometimes it can feel like, at least for me, sometimes I feel like I don't want to burden people with some of my pain, so I just keep it inside, which is probably not a good way of coping. But yeah, thank you so much for sharing that, Wendy. I think Miriam has our next question.
Yeah, and there's a component of trust too. Like sometimes we don't want to share certain things with certain people. Wendy, you talk in your author's note, I believe, about your complex regional principle. And you talk about how this invisible disability can make you feel unseen. And we wondered if you might talk more about that and we talk on ways that might help you feel more seen.
Well, I definitely feel seen if when I've told somebody, what if they've asked what the conditions are, and if they've actually looked it up, to I know that makes me know that they want to know what it is, or if they ask about what your life is like, because when you've got something unusual, your life is usually pretty unusual. So that shows that they understand that your day-to-day life is going to be different than the average person, and that I guess the reason that's important is that there's so many ways that when people are talking, they've got kind of a framework in the back of their mind about this is how, you know, the day tends to go for somebody or how things are done. And so when that's different, it can really change the context, and it's important to know. So just knowing that someone is asked that question makes me feel seen, that they're curious about that. Um, those are
And,
probably the two main things I think that make me feel seen.
and would you mind telling us what what do what does your day-to-day life look like these days?
Well, it's I guess I would start with the environment. It has to be adapted. It's kind of complicated because I've got different medical issues that interact with each other. So one of the effects of things is that I've got severe light sensitivity. Coming in, they would see that it's kind of like being in a photographer's darkroom where it's all just very dim red light. Put on the amber light at the beginning for the video, but candlelight and stuff. So it's a really dim, and I've just gotten used to it. But for somebody coming in, it would be really unusual. Um, I'm kind of up and down a lot during the day because I have to rest the leg a lot. Um, things if they were just kind of to look around, things are just very adapted. Like there's lights on appliances that have had to be covered up, and things have had to be placed in really ergonomic positions. Um, this is something where it's like it's hard to almost see the forest for the trees because I have to actually kind of stop and think about this, like what um, the word that just comes is adapted. Like nothing that if I were to purchase something, I never use it right out of the box. It's got to be outgassed because I've also got MCS. It's usually got to be adapted somehow. And like also just buying stuff, I usually don't just kind of go online and buy the standard product. I usually have to do research with most things that I do to actually find something that'll work. So things that seem simple take more time in my life. That's definitely a kind of a general rule. And just that there's not the energy that I used to have. So I have to be really, really thinking through what I'm going to do and just pick the most important, because those top one or two things is probably all that's going to get done. So I've really had to get realistic there. And like going out of the house is like a huge ordeal. So I don't actually go out that much. Physically getting ready, and I also have a wheelchair and everything when I go out, and then with the severe light sensitivity, I have to cover my eyes, so can't see anyway. And then I usually get sick because um, at home I can control the air quality and products that are used and all of that, but you can't really do that in public. And so there's usually something that I end up reacting to and getting a migraine triggered. And so anyway, it's just things are complicated. Um, and that's just kind of the day-to-day life. So I guess it's hard to explain. So I guess there's kind of a push-pull there. It's like I want people to understand what day-to-day life is like. And then I have to admit that it's hard for me to summarize it. So it must be hard for them to understand it on their end when it's hard for me to even express.
Well, we really appreciate you sharing all that with us. And I'm a migraine person too, so I know what it's like when you can be out in the world and not be able to control what's going on. So thank you, Wendy, for sharing that with our listeners.
Thank you.
Okay, so now comes the point in the podcast where it's my favorite part, which is we're hoping that you both can ask each other questions about your pieces, if there might be something that came up for you as you were reading them again in preparation for today. So, Konnie, can I invite you to ask Wendy something?
Yeah, Wendy, thank you for sharing all that with us. It actually inspires some hope just to hear your graciousness in sharing about something that is vulnerable. I wonder, just even reading your poem, this thought came to mind. I'm wondering how long you've had this condition or these conditions, and what advice might you give to someone who is diagnosed with an invisible disability as an adult?
Well, I had an accident in 1997 that gave me part of the picture, and that was this. I have a severe neck injury, which has gotten kind of complicated. But when the CRPS came in and the severe light sensitivity and all that, the severe light sensitivity came in at 2010 when the migraines were getting really intense, and the CRPS came in 2014. So I think your question, you had said something about when they're diagnosed, what to do.
Yeah, I specifically like you weren't born with these conditions, so you probably remember a time that was different. What would your advice be? What would your advice be to somebody who is diagnosed with something like that later in life?
Oh goodness. Well, I guess I could say what not to do.
Okay.
I mean, I'll start with that. I kept getting, when I would talk with doctors, um, I shouldn't say doctors, one doctor that I'm thinking about especially, I was asking him for ways to cope in just day-to-day life with the severe light sensitivity, because I didn't know what to do. I mean, I didn't even have the solution of like red light at that point. I was like, going around with this tiny little flashlight where I'd like taped off most of it so a little tiny beam came through. I didn't know what to do, and because that's all I could think of. So when I asked him that, he said, "Well, I don't want to help you cope with this. I just want to help you heal it." And and yes, of course, I want to try to heal this, but I don't. This is in God's hands whether it's going to heal or not. I mean, we do what we can, and it heals or it doesn't. But in the meantime, you do need to find ways to cope. And so that's something that I just found was really important and really missing, that the day-to-day life piece. When I would go to providers and stuff, they didn't really want to look at that. And so I really had to struggle to find solutions on my own. So I guess putting an equal amount of energy into finding solutions to cope as in doing the healing would be one. The other is, I mean, this is just kind of an obvious, but getting as much sleep as you can, because a lot gets processed as you sleep. Giving yourself a lot of grace periods to just kind of, everybody has different personality types, but like I need to just kind of zone out a little bit with an audiobook or with doing art, and basically turning to the things that kind of relax you more, giving yourself a little bit more time with that. Looking back, I found the art was especially important. I do soul collage. That helps me process things. And the cards that I made during that period, I think were really important for me. But different people would cope differently. Like if this were to happen to Joseph, my husband, I can imagine that he would spend a lot of time out in nature, which I used to do before this stuff happened, or spend more time in the garden.
That's really helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah, you remind me, Wendy, of this term cryptax that where the crypt community just teaches one another how to think, how to survive, and you get certain advice from medical people, and some are better than others, but some people who live in their bodies these ways have hacked different ways of being. So thank you for sharing.
Thank you.
We wondered if you, Wendy, might have a question or reflection for Konnie.
Well, I was just really your research that you've done here. I love the concept of reconstructing trauma. I mean, reframing is neat too, but there's something about that term reconstructing, bringing in more of the creative element. Who was the author who coined that?
So that's Judith Herman, and that's an older book, I think 95. She started talking about reconstructing trauma narratives as a therapist who worked with all sorts of people who'd faced a variety of traumas.
I really like that. Have you used that in your own life? And how has that, if you have, like maybe an example of that and how it looks? And
yeah, so definitely. I'd say as a survivor of complex trauma, I have I've used my trauma as kind of a catalyst for needing to do things differently for the next generation. There's like pretty strong ongoing intergenerational trauma in my family, and for me, that those experiences really propelled me to do a lot of the research I've done, to do the work I've done. And so, I mean, I've also done a lot of therapy. It's not just a sweep it under the rug to move forward sort of thing. But as like looking back 15 years down the road into like my therapeutic healing process, I would say the trauma has become a reason to care for people who've experienced trauma, to work with survivors, and to write in ways that are empowering to survivors, both from a theological perspective and a psychological perspective. So I think that's largely how I have reframed or reconstructed my narrative is, yes, I am a survivor, and I am also a loving mother. I am also a teacher. I am also a friend and a minister and a wife and a PhD student. So it's reconstructing my narrative to always remember like that it is one of my identities and not my identity.
What are maybe some, if somebody's kind of overwhelmed about finding what their story is and reconstructing it, are there any things you found helpful there? Any kind of tips, ways to do it?
Do you mean like if they don't remember their story, or
More like having a hard time putting it in words, finding the images. Maybe there's like lots of pieces, kind of figuring out like what to focus on.
yeah, yes. So I'm a big fan of different, I'd say. So Amy and I both like I was one on the teaching team in a class with Amy this year, so she knows some of my bend on this. But in counseling, I would be a fan of kind of multifaceted counseling that looks at the whole person, even in integrating nature into it or art into it. As you have said, those are some of your coping mechanisms. Even I would say constructing and reconstructing a trauma narrative rarely happens through just an oral explanation of something, because trauma doesn't live in the part of the brain that can construct an oral narrative well. So whether that is in fragments, in pieces, or whether that happens through poetry, like you're writing, or think of like Dr. Gildy, who recently published like The Poetics of Belonging, or whether it happens, for me, journaling was a big piece, and I'd say in fragments is how I would write. But gardening has also been a big piece, as I weed and get that little dash of dopamine from getting out a root. It's been therapeutic in that way, and has also let me sit with those various pieces that I can't necessarily name, but that I can reorient in the garden and create beauty out of a field of weeds. So it's, the coping mechanisms are different for everyone, but I'd say modalities that attend to parts of the brain that speech cannot, are very, very helpful.
I like that. And I like how you said reorienting, because it's like we don't always need the words. It doesn't, the,
Yeah.
it's more something that just kind of happens inside you, even if you can't name it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I like that.
Well, thank you both so much. It has come to the time where we must end today's episode. So we just want to thank you so much for coming and spending time with us today and sharing your stories and sharing some crip hacks, like Miriam had said, as we all continue in our community to help each other and love each other on our journey. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having
Thank
us.
you. This was awesome. And it was really good meeting you, all of you.